The mist clung to the hollows of Blackwood like a shroud, softening the edges of the ancient mountains as Alara Vance's rental car navigated the narrow, serpentine road. She drove slowly, the tires crunching over gravel where pavement gave way, her hands steady on the wheel. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, carried a chill that seeped through the cracked window. She was here not to expose, but to understand. A journalist tracing the quiet, tangled roots of Appalachian families, armed with respect and a recorder, not preconceptions. Decaying structures dotted the landscape, their histories written in sagging porches and boarded windows. Here and there, a newer trailer stood beside a century-old cabin, a testament to a reluctant, uneven progress. Power lines grew sparse, then vanished entirely as she descended deeper into the valley. The town of Blackwood Hollow, when it appeared, was less a town than a scattering of dwellings clinging to the hillside. A gas station that doubled as a general store, a post office the size of a tool shed, and a white-clapboard church whose steeple pointed a slender finger at the gray sky. Alara parked near the store and stepped out, the silence pressing in on her. It was a heavy quiet, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the pines and the distant cry of a hawk. She felt eyes on her before she saw them. A man pumping gas watched her with a still, unblinking gaze, then slowly turned back to his task. A woman on a porch across the way paused her rocking, her hands stilling in her lap. Their looks were not hostile, but deeply measured, a wariness carved by generations of isolation and a history of outsiders who came to gawk or judge. She walked toward the store, her footsteps loud in the quiet. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of coffee and cured meat. The man behind the counter, his face a roadmap of lines, gave a slow nod. "Help you?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Just passing through," Alara said, offering a small, respectful smile. "It's a beautiful area." He grunted, a non-committal sound, and wiped the counter with a cloth. "Ain't much for passin' through to." She bought a bottle of water and a local map, engaging in the gentle dance of small talk, commenting on the weather, the scenery. His answers were polite but clipped, each word carefully chosen. It was in the spaces between his sentences that she felt the truth of the place. A profound, protective silence. This was a community that had learned the hard way that the outside world rarely brought anything but trouble. As she left, the bell on the door chiming behind her, she felt the weight of their collective gaze once more. They were waiting to see what kind of outsider she would turn out to be. The small church at the edge of Blackwood Hollow was even more weathered up close, its white paint peeling like sunburnt skin. Reverend Miller, a man with a patient face and tired eyes, had agreed to let Alara see the old records after a careful, quiet conversation on his porch the day before. He'd spoken of the church's history with a soft pride, but his posture had tightened almost imperceptibly when she mentioned family lineages. He'd handed her the key with a slow, deliberate motion, a silent test of her intentions. Inside, the air was cool and carried the faint, sweet scent of old wood and hymnals. Sunlight filtered through a single stained glass window, casting colored patterns on the dusty floorboards. The records were kept in a small back room, in a heavy oak cabinet whose key turned with a rusty protest. The ledgers inside were massive, their leather covers cracked and spines frayed. She lifted the first one with reverence, the weight of it substantial in her hands. The pages were thick, yellowed parchment, the handwriting a meticulous, looping cursive in faded brown ink. Births, deaths, and marriages 1880-1910, the spine read. Alara laid the book gently on the small wooden table, her reporter's notebook and digital camera beside it. She began systematically, her movements methodical. She wasn't hunting for scandal. She was tracing patterns, the way a historian would. She started with the births, photographing each page for later cross-referencing, her finger tracing the elegant script. The surnames were the first thing she noted. Blackwood, Mullins, Osborne. Again and again. It wasn't unusual for an isolated community to have a limited pool of names, but the frequency was striking. She opened her notebook and began to chart them, a simple family tree taking shape. It was the dates that pricked her professional curiosity. She saw a Martha Blackwood born in March of 1892. Then, on the next page, a marriage record for a Martha Blackwood to a Thomas Blackwood in April of 1910. She was 18, a common age for the time. But then she found their first child, a son, born in December of that same year, 8 months after the wedding. A hasty marriage was not itself a clue, but it was a thread. She pulled another ledger, this one from 1910 to 1940. She followed Thomas and Martha's line. For children survived infancy, all with the Stark Blackwood name. She then traced Thomas's own birth record. His mother was an Osborne. She flipped back to the earlier ledger, found Martha's mother. Also an Osborne. First cousins, perhaps? It was a possibility, one seen in countless isolated communities throughout history. But the pattern deepened, grew tighter. She found another Blackwood marriage from 1925. Elijah Blackwood to Rebecca Blackwood. Their birth records were just 2 years apart, listed at the same address. Siblings. The notation was plain, unadorned by any special mark or comment. It was simply recorded as fact. A quiet, sober realization settled over her, cold and clear. This wasn't just about a few cousin marriages over generations. This was a systematic, generations-long pattern of unions within an extremely tight genetic circle. The dates didn't hint at consanguinity. They quietly, insistently, confirmed it. There was no shock, no revulsion. Only a dawning, profound understanding of the sheer isolation these ledgers represented. Each carefully inked entry was a testament to a community forced inward, onto itself, creating a world where the same names appeared in every column, generation after generation. The family tree less a branching thing and more a tightly wound knot. The scent of wood smoke and simmering beans guided Alara to the small cabin tucked behind a grove of birch trees. May's home was a testament to quiet endurance. Its logs weathered to a soft silver, the porch swept clean. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, a promise of warmth against the encroaching evening chill. May herself was on the porch, shelling peas into a chipped enamel bowl. She didn't look up as Alara approached, but her hands stilled. "Saw you comin' down the path," she said, her voice as dry and soft as autumn leaves. "Figured you might be hungry. Town don't hold much for a decent meal." Alara stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, careful not to intrude. "That's kind of you. I'm Alara Vance." "I know who you are." May finally looked up, her eyes a pale, watery blue set deep in a web of wrinkles. They held a sharp intelligence that belied her age. "Reverend Miller said you were respectful with his books. Said you handled them like they was your own." She gave a short, approving nod. "Sit then. Stew's near ready." The inside of the cabin was sparse but immaculate. A cast-iron pot hung in the fireplace, filling the single room with the rich, savory smell of venison and herbs. May served 2 bowls without ceremony, and they ate in a silence that was not quite comfortable, but not hostile either. It was a silence of assessment. "You're a skin about families," May stated finally, not looking at Alara but into the fire. It wasn't a question. "I am," Alara said, setting her spoon down. "I'm trying to understand how people lived here, how they stayed. The records tell one story. I'd like to hear the others." May was quiet for a long time, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the scrape of her spoon. "Stories have roots," she said at last. "Some roots run deep and tangle together. Pullin' at one can shake the whole tree." She turned her gaze on Alara, and the protective concern in it was palpable, a fierce, maternal instinct for the land and its people. "You seem a decent sort, so I'll tell you this plain. Folks around here, we value our privacy. We look after our own. There's things that ain't talked about. Not out of meanness, but out of care." She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping, not to a whisper, but to a low, serious register meant to be heard and heeded. "You keep looking in them books, you're gonna see things. Things that might seem strange to someone from away. You'll see the same names close together. You'll start asking questions about blood." She paused, letting the weight of the word hang in the air between them. "I'm telling you, child, be careful what you ask. Some questions, Once they're asked, can't be unasked. And the answers, they don't always set you free. Sometimes they just build a different kind of fence. She went back to her stew, the cryptic warning delivered. It wasn't a threat, but a plea from a woman who had seen enough of the world to know that truth could be a weapon. And her people had already been wounded enough. May set her empty bowl aside, her gaze fixed on the low flames as if reading some truth in their dance. The firelight carved deep shadows into the lines of her face, making her look both ancient and weary. The comfortable silence from their meal had shifted into something heavier, thick with unspoken history. My own people, she began, her voice softer now, almost lost in the crackle of the fire. We've been here since these mountains were first settled, came over from the old country, Scots mostly, looking for land nobody else wanted. And they found it, she gave a short, humorless laugh. Found it and got trapped by it. She looked at Alara then, her eyes holding a deep, complicated sorrow. You think it's just names in a book, but it's land. It's knowing every creek and holler, every good place to hunt, every patch of soil that'll yield a crop. It's your name on a deed, the only thing in this world that's truly yours. When you're that poor and that cut off, you hold on. You hold on tight to what's yours. She paused, her work-roughened hands clasped tightly in her lap. There was whispers, always, even when I was a girl. Talk about keeping the lines pure, keeping the land in the family. It wasn't said with pride, mind you. It was just a fact, like the weather, a hard thing you had to live with. Her voice grew thick, and she looked away, swallowing hard. My grandmother, she married her first cousin. It was the only way the farm wouldn't get split up, sold off to pay debts. She told me once, just before she passed, that she loved him like a brother, because he was. But she did her duty. They had 7 children. Lived. A single tear traced a path through the fine dust on her cheek, but she made no move to wipe it away. The shame she felt wasn't for herself, but for the generations of quiet, desperate choices made in the name of survival. You look at us from the outside and you see something wrong, something twisted, but from in here, it was just life. A hard life that demanded hard choices. We knew other ways led to losing it all, the land, the name, everything that made us who we were. So we turned inward. We closed ranks. She finally wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. A quick, angry gesture. The shame ain't in the blood, girl. It's in the having to choose it. It's in the knowing that the world outside would call you a monster for doing what you had to do to keep your children from starving. So we stopped talking to the world outside. And we stopped talking about it amongst ourselves. The silence, it became the offering. The price of staying. She fell silent again, the confession hanging in the warm, smoky air. It wasn't a justification, but an explanation steeped in generations of love for a place that had demanded so much from them. The emotion wasn't self-pity. It was the raw, enduring ache of a woman whose loyalty to her community was inextricably woven with its most painful secrets. May's cabin held its history in layers, like the rings of an old tree. After her confession, a fragile quiet had settled between them, broken only by the hiss of the fire. May rose stiffly, her movements slow with the weight of memory. Might be something else you ought to see, she said, her voice low. Since you're wanting the whole story, and not just the pieces that look pretty in a book. She crossed to an old sea chest pushed into a shadowed corner, its wood dark with age and its iron fittings rusted. Kneeling with a soft grunt, she lifted the lid. The scent of cedar and old paper drifted out. Inside were not treasures in any conventional sense, but the quiet archives of a life. Folded quilts, a man's worn Bible, bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon. May moved these aside with a practiced gentleness until her fingers brushed against a small, flat object wrapped in brittle oilcloth tucked at the very bottom. She hesitated for a breath, then drew it out. My great-grandmother's, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, told to keep it hid. But hidin' ain't the same as forgettin'. Back at the fireside, she carefully unfolded the cloth. Inside was a photograph, its edges worn soft and its surface marked with the faint silver scars of age. It was a family portrait, but unlike any Alara had seen in the church ledgers. The couple sat ramrod straight on two ladder-back chairs, their faces solemn and unsmiling, as was the custom of the time. The man's hand rested stiffly on the woman's shoulder, a gesture meant to convey matrimony, but which instead looked like a claim of ownership. The woman's eyes, dark and direct, held a resilience that seemed to challenge the camera itself. Their features were not just similar. They were nearly identical. The same strong jaw, the same deep-set eyes, the same stubborn set of the mouth. Siblings, posed as man and wife. Before them, arranged by height, stood 5 children. Their clothes were clean but patched, their faces pale and serious. The 2 eldest, a boy and a girl, shared the parents' distinct features, the familial resemblance unmistakable and intensified. The younger 3, while still bearing the strong Blackwood brow and jaw, showed a subtle softening, a slight asymmetry around the eyes that hinted at the genetic toll of their origins. Alara held the photograph gently, her journalist's mind cataloging the details. The stark backdrop of a log wall, the worn boots peeking from beneath long skirts and trousers, the absolute lack of any frivolity. But her human heart felt a profound, empathetic unease. This was no shocking spectacle. It was a document of stark necessity. The haunted familiarity between the subjects spoke of a bond twisted by circumstance, a shared history that was both their foundation and their cage. She felt no revulsion, only a deep, sobering sadness for the choices etched into their stiff poses and weary eyes. This hidden image was the truth May had spoken of. Not a secret of depravity, but a painful heirloom of survival, kept out of sight but never truly out of mind. The path to Jacob's cabin was little more than a deer trail, winding up a steep, wooded slope where the mist never fully lifted. Alara followed May's directions carefully, the damp air cool against her skin, the scent of decaying leaves and wet stone thick in her lungs. The isolation here was profound, a silence broken only by the scuff of her boots on rock and the distant call of a crow. It felt less like a place someone lived and more like a place someone had retreated to, a final redoubt against a world that had judged too harshly. The cabin appeared suddenly, a low structure of rough-hewn logs hunched beneath a heavy canopy of hemlock. Smoke curled from a rusted stovepipe, and the clearing around it was littered with wood shavings that curled like pale petals on the dark earth. The man himself was seated on a stump before the open door, a piece of walnut in one hand and a carving knife in the other. He didn't look up as she approached, but his shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. He'd been expecting her. "Jacob," Alara said, stopping a respectful distance away. "May sent me." He was older than she'd imagined, his face a landscape of deep lines and weathered skin, but his hands moved with a sure, steady grace over the wood. He finally lifted his head, his eyes the color of flint. They held no welcome, but no active hostility either, just a deep, weary caution. "May don't send many folks my way," he said, his voice a low rasp, like stone grinding on stone. "Reckon she must trust you some." He gestured with his chin toward another stump. "Sit if you're of a mind to." Alara sat, placing her recorder on the ground between them but not turning it on. This wasn't an interview yet. It was a negotiation of trust. She watched his hands work, the blade peeling away thin, precise curls from the wood. He was carving a family of bears, a large one, a slightly smaller one, and 2 cubs, all connected by the grain of the single block of wood. It was a beautiful, intricate piece, but there was a tension in it, a sense of the figures being bound together whether they wished to be or not. "You're here about the old ways," he stated, not a question. He kept his eyes on his work. "I'm trying to understand them," Alara said, "not condemn them." Jacob gave a short, dry sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Condemnation was always plenty. Never had a shortage of that from the outside. He fell silent for a long moment, the knife whispering against the wood. "You think it was about wickedness," he said at last. "About folks not knowin' right from wrong. It wasn't. It was about the land. And the snow." He set the carving down gently on a cloth beside him and finally met her gaze. His eyes were clear and direct. My granddaddy told me stories of the winters in the old days. How the snow would drift so high it buried the first floor of the cabin. How the game would vanish and the stored crops would run low. Outsiders? Doctors? Preachers from the valley? They were months away and the passes were closed. You had who you had. Your family. The folks in the next holler, if you were lucky, and they'd made it through themselves. He picked up a new block of wood, his fingers tracing the grain. When a young man came of age, his choices were slim. Marry a girl from the next ridge if her family would have him, and if it meant giving up a piece of your land as dowry. Or watch the farm get split and sold off bit by bit to pay taxes to a government that forgot you existed. Or, he paused, the knife hovering. Or you looked to your own, a sister, a cousin. You kept the land whole. You kept the name. You kept the food in your children's mouths through the winter. It wasn't born from depravity, girl. It was born from desperation. A cold, hard calculus of survival that folks in towns with paved roads and general stores never had to make. He began to carve again, his movements slower now, more deliberate. We knew the risks. Saw em in the children who didn't thrive. But the risk of starving was greater than the risk of that. So you made your choice. You prayed. And you hoped the good Lord would understand that you were just trying to save what was yours. He held up the new carving. It was the same bear family, but one of the cubs was misshapen, its form twisted, yet still held close within the embrace of the larger figures. A fractured but enduring tie. We ain't monsters. We're just people who got left behind, and we did what we had to do to endure. Jacob's knife stilled. The misshapen cub rested in his palm, a silent testament in walnut. The damp air of the hollow seemed to grow heavier, the mist clinging to the pines like a shroud for secrets long kept. He didn't look at Alara, but at the carving, as if seeing another time reflected in the polished wood. You ask about the consequences, he said, his voice low and stripped of the defensive rasp from before. Now it was just tired, deeply, irrevocably tired. The ledgers show the marriages. The stories tell the why. But they don't show you the children. He set the carving down with a soft click. I had a friend, Samuel, lived 2 hollers over. We'd fish together in the creek when we were boys. He was quick, funny, could mimic any bird call you ever heard. A faint, sad smile touched Jacob's lips, then vanished. His parents were first cousins. Nobody talked about it. It was just how it was. But by the time we were 10, Sam, he changed. Started getting bad headaches. His hands would shake. He'd forget things. Where he'd put his fishing pole, the way home. Jacob's gaze was fixed on some point in the middle distance, seeing the past unfold in the gray mist. His folks, they were good people. God-fearing, hard-working. But they had nothing. No money for a doctor, even if they could have gotten him down the mountain to one. And there was the shame, the fear of what people would say. So they kept him close, took him out of school. He just disappeared from the world. He described it not with drama, but with a chilling, matter-of-fact clarity. He had seizures. His spine started to curve. By the time he was 15, he couldn't walk proper. They kept him in a back room, away from visitors. His mama would sit with him for hours, reading from the Bible. They loved him. That was the hell of it. They loved him fierce. But their love couldn't fix what was written in his blood. It was just a fact, like a rock in the soil you can't move. Jacob finally turned his flinty eyes to Alara. The anger was gone, replaced by a profound and weary sadness. It wasn't just Sam. There were others. A girl over on Osborne Ridge born with a heart that wasn't right. Lived till she was 12, blue-lipped and breathless. A boy who never spoke a word, just rocked on the porch all day, every day. Their families, they weren't neglectful. They were trapped. Too poor for doctors, too proud for pity. So they did the only thing they could. They loved him in silence and hid him away, hoping the outside world would never see, and never judge. He picked up his knife again, not to carve, but just to hold. The consequence wasn't just the sickness. It was the silence that grew up around it, thicker and deeper than these mountains. Jacob's gaze remained fixed on the knife in his hand, the blade catching a sliver of dull light from the overcast sky. The silence stretched, thick with the weight of his memories. When he spoke again, his voice was even lower, as if sharing something not just private, but sacred in its sorrow. The silence, he repeated, almost to himself. That was the real sickness, worse than any tremor or crooked spine. Festered. The families who had children like Sam, they bore a double burden. The grief of the affliction and the shame of its cause. They knew what folks whispered, even if nobody said it to their faces. Keeping it in the family, bad blood. He shook his head slowly, a gesture of weary resignation. Some couldn't bear it. The stares at church, the way conversations would die when they walked into the store. So they did the only thing they could think to do. They moved. Not out to some town where a doctor might be found. That would have meant admitting it, asking for help from the very people they feared would scorn them. No, they moved deeper, higher up into the hills, back into the coves and hollers so tight the sun only hit the ground for an hour a day. He gestured with the knife toward the impenetrable woods surrounding his cabin. They'd find a patch of flat land by a creek, build a new cabin far from any road or neighbor. They'd think they were escaping the judgment. But all they were doing was building a taller fence around their secret. Isolating themselves even more, his voice took on a bitter edge. And what happens when you're that cut off? Your kids grow up. There's nobody else. The only choices are the same choices their parents had. The cycle don't get broken. It just gets buried deeper, wrapped in more silence and more shame. One generation's attempt to hide became the next generation's prison. He finally looked at Alara, his expression grim. The judgment they were running from? It became a self-fulfilling prophecy. By hiding, they made themselves seem more strange, more secretive. It just fed the rumors they were trying to escape. And the ones who stayed in the main hollow, the ones whose children were healthy, they saw what happened to those who left. It became a warning, a lesson. You don't talk. You don't ask for help. You endure your troubles in private because the alternative, the scorn, the exile, was a fate worse than any sickness. The stigma didn't just mark the families. It built the walls around all of us, higher and stronger with every generation. The small house sat at the end of a dirt track so overgrown it seemed the forest was slowly reclaiming it. Paint peeled from the clapboards in long, gray curls, and the porch steps sagged wearily underfoot. A line of clean, patched laundry fluttered in the damp breeze, a small, defiant flag of normalcy. May had spoken of Sarah Osborne with a quiet respect, and had asked Alara to bring a basket of early apples from her tree. Don't stare, May had warned softly. Just be kind. Sarah answered the door after the second knock, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. She was a woman in her late 50s, perhaps, but life had carved years deeper into her face. Her eyes, however, were clear and direct, holding a resilience that reminded Alara of the woman in the hidden photograph. May said you might be by, Sarah said, her voice calm. She accepted the basket with a nod of thanks. You're the one writin' about the families. I'm trying to understand the history, Alara said. The whole history. Sarah studied her for a long moment, then opened the door wider. Come in, then, but keep your voice low. My boy is resting. The inside of the house was spotless, though sparsely furnished. The air held the clean scent of lye soap and simmering broth. In a corner of the main room, a hospital bed was arranged to face a window looking out onto the green woods. In it lay a man, his body still under a light quilt. His features were softened, almost childlike in sleep, but the telltale signs of a congenital disorder were present in the delicate structure of his face and the slight, perpetual curve of his spine. He was perhaps 30, but seemed ageless, suspended in a state of dependent youth. This is Eli, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a gentle hush. She adjusted his blanket with a touch that was both practiced and tender. He's had a tired morning. She motioned for Alara to sit at the small kitchen table. "He was born early," she began, without preamble. There was no self-pity in her tone, only the flat, weary recitation of fact. The closest hospital was 2 counties over, and the truck broke down on the mountain road that night. By the time my husband got it running and got us there, well, the doctor said there were complications. Said his brain didn't get enough oxygen. She poured 2 cups of tea from a pot on the stove, her hands steady. Later, when we understood more about our family, we knew it was more than that. She sat down, cradling her cup. "He never walked, never talked, has seizures sometimes. His lungs are weak." She listed these things not as a complaint, but as a simple inventory of their life. "We did the best we could. My husband, God rest him, worked himself to death in the mines to pay for what medicines we could get. I learned to care for him. The visiting nurse comes once a month from the county, but it's not enough. Never enough." Her gaze drifted back to her son, and her expression softened into something that was purely, fiercely loving. "He knows me. He smiles when I sing to him. He loves the sound of the rain on the roof." She looked back at Alara, her eyes clear and unwavering. "People think it's a tragedy, a burden. Maybe it is. But he's my son. I don't regret him. I regret the world that made him this way. I regret the isolation that meant there was no one to tell us, no one to help us understand what we were risking. We were just alone, doing what we thought was right to keep a family together." She fell silent, sipping her tea. There was no melodrama, only the quiet, bone-deep fatigue of a life spent in unwavering vigilance and love. Her anguish was not a loud, performative thing. It was the silent, daily weight of responsibility, born not out of neglect, but from a profound lack of options. She was not a victim of her circumstances, but a monument to resilience within them. Her love for Eli, the one unassailable truth in a life defined by harsh, hidden realities. The records in the church basement were more than genealogies. They were a moral ledger, written in fading ink and the quiet language of compromise. Alara returned with Reverend Miller's hesitant blessing, the key cold in her hand. The air down there was still and carried the scent of damp stone and old paper, a sacred silence that seemed to hold its breath. She focused now on the marriage certificates and the preacher's notes scrawled in the margins of the family Bibles donated to the church archive. The handwriting varied, spidery and precise from the late 1800s, looser and more rushed as the decades wore on. But the pattern that emerged was consistent and deeply unsettling. She found the record for Elijah and Rebecca Blackwood, the siblings from the photograph. The certificate was startlingly ordinary, filed between a Mullins-Osborne union and a Blackwood second-cousin marriage. The officiant was listed as Pastor Hezekiah Brewer, 1925. In the margin of the family Bible, in the same brown ink, was a tiny, tight script. Asterisk joined in the eyes of God and this community for the preservation of land and lineage. May the Lord have mercy star. It was not an isolated notation. She found another from 1938, for a union of first cousins. The preacher, a different man, had written, asterisk sanctioned to prevent the fracturing of the Blackwood acreage. The land must remain whole for the children's sustenance asterisk another, from 1910, was even more stark. Asterisk no other suitable match available. The farm cannot support an outsider's claim. Blessed in the hope of future mercy star. Alara leaned back, the weight of the words settling over her. This wasn't a story of rogue preachers defying doctrine. It was a story of men of faith trapped in an impossible position. They weren't villains. They were shepherds of a flock stranded on an island of their own making. Their choice was between strict adherence to distant canonical law and the immediate, visceral survival of their congregation. She thought of Reverend Miller's tired eyes, the way he'd handed her the key. This was his inheritance, too. These notations were a chronicle of pastoral triage. In the face of brutal poverty and geographic imprisonment, these preachers had made a horrific calculus. They had chosen to sanctify a transgression to prevent a greater one, the starvation of families, the loss of their only earthly anchor, the land. They had offered a blessing, however hesitant, to keep their people from fracturing entirely, betting on God's understanding over man's judgment. It was a burden of leadership she could scarcely fathom, a testament to how isolation could bend even the most steadfast morals into shapes of tragic necessity. The church hadn't caused the practice. It had been forced to manage it, to sanctify the desperate in order to save the whole. The diary was tucked between the brittle pages of a disintegrating family Bible, its leather cover soft as old skin, the spine nearly worn away. Elara handled it with the reverence of an archivist, her cotton-gloved fingers carefully lifting it from its hiding place. The first page, in a faded, copperplate script, read, Esther May Blackwood. Her book, 1890 *. The ink was brown with age, but the hand was steady, each letter formed with a careful, practiced grace. Elara began to read, and Esther's voice emerged from the page not as a relic, but as a clear, resonant presence. Pragmatic, weary, and heartbreakingly young. April 12, 1890. The frost finally left the ground for good this week. Pa and Thomas got the north field planted with corn. I took them their noon meal and stayed to help for a spell. The soil is still cold, but the sun felt good on my back. Thomas's hands were raw and bleeding from the plow. He is a good brother, a good man. It is a cruel trick of God or fate that those two things must now become one star. April 28, 1890. Mr. Henderson from the bank came up from the valley today. He wore a fine suit and looked at our home like it was a pile of kindling. Pa met him on the porch, his back straight, but I saw his hands shaking. The mortgage is due. The last 2 winters were too hard, the harvests too thin. Henderson says the bank cannot extend again. He says we have until the 1st of October to pay the arrears, or the land will be sold. This land that my great-grandfather cleared with his own 2 hands. Pa did not speak after the man left. He just sat by the fire, staring at nothing star. May 15, 1890. Preacher Miller came to supper tonight. He and Pa spoke long after the table was cleared, their voices low and serious. Ma was quiet, her face pale. After he left, Pa called Thomas and me into the front room. His meaning was plain, though the words came hard. There is no money for a dowry to bring a wife in for Thomas. There is no money for a trousseau to send me away. The only asset we possess is the land itself, and it cannot be divided star. Pa said Preacher Miller had agreed, that it was not the Lord's first wish, but that he understood survival. He said it was the only way to keep the farm whole, to keep a roof over our heads and food in our bellies. He asked Thomas if he would do his duty. Thomas, good and solid Thomas, just nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes on the floor. Then Pa looked at me. My choice was no choice at all. To refuse was to make us all beggars. To agree was to save them. I said yes. I will marry my brother in the autumn star. June 3, 1890. We do not speak of it. Life goes on as it always has. I mend Thomas's shirts. He brings me wildflowers from the meadow. We are playing a terrible, silent game of pretend, acting as though we are still just brother and sister, and not a betrothed couple awaiting a wedding that feels more like a funeral. The shame is a cold stone in my belly, but beneath the shame is a fiercer feeling, a determination that Blackwood land will not be lost. If this is the price, then I will pay it star. October 10th, 1890. The deed is done. We were wed yesterday in the front room before Preacher Miller and our parents. I wore my mother's dress, let out at the seams. Thomas wore our father's suit, the shoulders too broad for him. We said the words. They tasted like ash. Preacher Miller's blessing was quiet, his eyes sad. He knows the necessity, but I saw the conflict in his gaze. He asked the Lord for mercy upon this union. I pray he is listening star. November 28th, 1890. The first snow fell today, a early dusting that warns of the hard months to come. The mortgage is paid. The land is secure. This is the cold comfort we must warm our hands by. Thomas and I share the bed now, but we lie as far apart as its width will allow. 2 strangers bound by blood and duty. We speak of the weather, the livestock, The need to mend the barn roof before the deep cold sets in. We do not speak of us star. January 15th, 1891. Asterisk the hollow is sealed shut by snow. The world has shrunk to the four walls of this cabin. The smell of simmering broth, and the endless white beyond the windows. There is a terrible, silent acceptance here. Ma does not meet my eye when she helps me with the washing. Pa claps Thomas on the shoulder too hard, a gesture meant to convey pride that rings hollow. We are all complicit in this. The whole community knows, and their silence is their sanction. In the face of a winter that could starve us all, strange arrangements become pragmatic. Survival justifies much star. February 22nd, 1891. Asterisk I am with child. The sickness comes in the mornings, a rolling wave of nausea that leaves me weak and trembling. Ma knows. She placed a cool hand on my brow this morning, and her eyes, so like my own, filled with a pity so deep it felt like a wound. There is no joy in this knowledge, only a creeping, cold fear. What if the child is not right? The stories are whispered, never shouted. Of babies born still or who fade within weeks, their tiny bodies unable to thrive. My fear is not for myself, but for the innocent life taking root within me, a life born of a decision meant to save a family star. March 30th, 1891. Asterisk I confessed my fears to Thomas last night in the dark. The words came out in a choked whisper. He did not reply at first. Then his hand found mine in the space between us. His grip was calloused and strong. We will love it, he said, his voice rough with an emotion I could not name. No matter what, it is ours and we will love it. That is all we can do. It was the first honest thing spoken between us since the wedding. It was not enough to erase the fear, but it was a torch in the overwhelming dark. We are in this together, bound by more than blood or land now. Bound by a shared, terrible hope star. Liam found her by the creek, where the water ran cold and clear over smooth stones. He was younger than the others she'd spoken to, maybe in his late 20s, with a restless energy that seemed at odds with the hollow's deep stillness. He didn't approach her directly at first, just stood a ways off, hands shoved in the pockets of his worn jacket, watching the water flow. "You're the writer," he said finally, his voice carrying easily over the gentle rush of the creek. It wasn't an accusation. Elara looked up from her notebook. "I am. Elara Vance." I know. He took a few steps closer, his boots scuffing the damp earth. He had the same strong features as the others, the unmistakable blackwood jaw, but his eyes held a different light. They were less guarded, more hungry. "My name's Liam. Liam Osborne. My great-great-grandmother was Esther." The name hung between them, a bridge built from the fragile pages of the diary. Elara closed her notebook. I read her words. She was a brave woman. Liam gave a short, sharp nod. She was. They all were. Doing what they had to. He kicked at a stone, sending it skittering into the water. "But we ain't stuck in 1890 anymore. We got roads now. Satellite internet if you're willin' to pay for it. The world ain't as far away as it used to be." He fell silent for a moment, gathering his thoughts. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, more intense. "My cousin, Jessica. She had a baby last year. Sweetest little thing you ever saw. But she's got a hole in her heart. They had to airlift her to Knoxville. It was a wake-up call. For some of us, anyway." He looked at Elara, his gaze direct and unwavering. "The old ones, they think silence is a shield. My granddad, he says talking about it is disloyal. Says it's airin' dirty laundry for outsiders to sneer at. But what's the loyalty in lettin' another baby be born with problems we could maybe prevent? What's the loyalty in keepin' people sick and scared in the dark?" His words came faster now, fueled by a frustration that was clearly long suppressed. "I've been to community college over in Pikeville. I've read things. I know it's not some curse or punishment. It's genetics. It's science. And science has answers. But we can't get help if we won't even say what's wrong." He scuffed his boot in the dirt again, the anger fading into a weary resolve. I'm tired of the secrets. I'm tired of seeing the fear in my mama's eyes every time one of the kids gets a cough, wondering if it's something more. This silence. It's killing us as sure as any bad gene. It's just slower. He looked at her, and the hope in his eyes was as palpable as the fear she'd seen in May's. It was a generational shift, standing right in front of her. A desire for change that was hopeful, but fraught with the risk of fracturing the very community he wanted to save. "I'll talk to you," he said, his voice firm. "I'll tell you whatever you need to know about my family, not to shame nobody, but because somebody's got to be the first to say it out loud. Somebody's got to break the silence." The summons came not with a phone call, but with a quiet, grim-faced visit from Reverend Miller himself. He stood on the porch of the small rental cabin, his hat in his hands, his expression pained. "There's some folks would like a word, Miss Vance," he said, his voice low. "Down at the community hall. Best you come now." The walk through the hollow felt different this time. The usual curtain of quiet observation had been pulled back, replaced by a palpable, simmering tension. People watched from their porches and windows, their faces hard and closed. The air itself felt charged, thick with a history of distrust for outsiders that stretched back generations. The community hall was a long, low building that smelled of old wood and floor wax. Inside, a group of 6 men and 2 women were seated at a folding table at the far end. They were the pillars of Blackwood Hollow, the head of the volunteer fire department, the owner of the general store, a few of the oldest landholders, and Mrs. Gable, the stern-faced postmistress. Their expressions were not angry, but grimly resolute. Reverend Miller took a seat slightly apart from them, a mediator by necessity, not choice. Alara stood before them, her recorder off and tucked away in her pocket. This was not a moment for notes. It was Harlan Moss, the store owner who'd first sold her a bottle of water, who spoke. His voice was calm, but there was a steel in it she hadn't heard before. "Miss Vance, we know you've been talking to folks. May, Jacob, Sarah Osborne. Even young Liam," he didn't phrase it as a question. "We know what you're after." Mrs. Gable leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly on the table. "Our people have suffered enough," she said, her voice sharp with a protective ferocity. "We've borne our burdens in silence and in dignity. We don't need some outsider coming in, poking at our scars, and holding 'em up for the world to gawk at." Another man, Elias Blackwood, a man in his 60s with arms like knotted rope, spoke up. "You take our pain, our private shame, and you'll make it into a spectacle. A headline for folks to read over their breakfast coffee before they turn the page. You'll call it Appalachian Inbreeding, and you'll make us out to be monsters. Freaks. We've seen it before." His words were not a shout, but they carried the weight of long memory. "You'll get your story and your awards, and then you'll leave. And we'll be left here with the pieces. Our children mocked, our dead disrespected. We'll be a joke." Their anger was a solid, formidable thing, but Alara understood its source. It wasn't irrational hostility. It was a deep, ingrained fear of exploitation, forged by a century of being misunderstood and caricatured by the world beyond their mountains. They saw her not as a person but as an archetype, the outsider who came to take. She waited until they were finished, meeting each of their gazes in turn. When she spoke, her voice was measured and calm, but it carried through the silent hall. "I hear you," she began, acknowledging their pain first. "And you're right to be wary. This place has been exploited before. Its stories have been twisted for shock value. I can't change that history." She took a slow breath, choosing her words with the utmost care. "But I am not here to write that story. I am here to write the story of survival, of impossible choices made in the face of poverty and geographic isolation that most people cannot even imagine. I'm here to write about Esther Blackwood's courage, and Sarah Osborne's devotion, and Jacob's endurance. I'm here to write about a community that did what it had to do to survive, and is now, finally, ready to seek a different future." She looked at Liam, who stood near the door, his jaw set, then back at the leaders. "This isn't about exposure for its own sake. It's about acknowledgement. The silence you've kept has been a shield, I understand that, but it has also been a prison. It has prevented help and perpetuated suffering. Ethical journalism isn't about tearing people down. It's about telling the truth with context and compassion, so that understanding can replace judgment, and so that help, she stressed the word, can finally find its way here. The room was utterly still. She had not raised her voice, but she had defended her purpose without flinching, acknowledging their fear while steadfastly refusing to be cast as the villain in their narrative. The ball was now in their court. The tension had not dissipated, but it had shifted, becoming a fragile, high-stakes standoff between the fear of the past and the terrifying possibility of a future. The silence in the community hall was a physical presence, thick and heavy with generations of fear and defiance. The leaders at the table held their ground, their expressions unyielding. Alara's words had landed, but they had not yet taken root in soil hardened by decades of self-protection. It was a stalemate, poised on the edge of either deeper fracture or fragile understanding. Then, a chair scraped softly near the back of the room. All eyes turned as May rose to her feet. She moved slowly, her hand resting on the back of the wooden chair for support, but her spine was straight, her chin lifted. The firelight from the pot-bellied stove caught the silver in her hair and the fierce determination in her pale eyes. She walked to the front of the room, not to stand with the leaders and not to stand with Alara, but to stand between them, a bridge of lived experience. She faced the table, her gaze sweeping over the men and women she had known her entire life. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried the quiet authority of age and endured pain. Harlan, Elias, Mary, she said, naming them softly. I hear your fear. I've lived inside it my whole life. We all have. We built these walls to keep the world out, to keep our shame hidden. We thought it was strength, she paused, her eyes glistening. But I am an old woman, and I am tired of strong walls. I am tired of the things we keep locked behind them. She turned slightly, including the whole room in her address. We hid my Aunt Clara away in a back room for 40 years because she shook and couldn't feed herself. We said it was to protect her dignity, but it was to protect our own. We buried children in unmarked graves on the hill and told ourselves it was God's will, and never spoke of it again. We have carried this alone for so long, we've forgotten what it is to not be bowed under the weight of it. Her voice grew stronger, laced with a passion that belied her frail appearance. This silence we're so determined to keep, it hasn't protected us. It has crippled us, kept the doctors away, kept the help away. It kept us from even admitting to each other the true cost of our survival. She looked directly at Elias Blackwood. Your boy, Elias, the one with the bad lungs. Would you have hidden him if you thought for 1 minute a doctor from outside could have helped him breathe easier? Or did the fear of what that doctor might think keep you from even asking? Elias looked down at his hands, his jaw working. May's gaze swept back to the others. This girl, she said, gesturing to Alara without looking at her. She ain't here to point fingers. She's here to listen. And she heard the truth. Not the ugly, twisted truth outsiders want to believe, but our truth. The truth of hard winters and impossible choices. Of love that persisted in the darkest of places. She finally turned to fully face the community leaders, her expression pleading yet unwavering. Hiding the truth has only deepened the suffering. It has not saved us. It has only ensured that the same sorrows visit our children, and our children's children. She wants to tell that story, the real story, so that maybe, finally, someone will hear it and send the kind of help we need. Not pity, understanding, not judgment, aid. She placed a trembling hand on the table, leaning forward. I am not asking you to do this for her. I am asking you to do it for us. For Sarah's boy. For Liam's future. For the chance that our grandchildren might know a different kind of life. One where a sickness is just a sickness, and not a secret that has to be buried. Her voice broke slightly, but she held her ground. It is time to stop being afraid of what we are. It is time to start fighting for what we could be. She fell silent. The change she advocated for was transformative, but it was believable, rooted not in a betrayal of her community, but in a profound, aching love for its future. She had reframed the narrative from one of individual blame to one of collective responsibility and the desperate, courageous need to finally break a cycle that silence had perpetuated for far too long. The path Liam led her up was not a path at all, but a steep, treacherous climb through undergrowth that clawed at their clothes. The air grew cooler, the light dimmer, as they ascended into a dense stand of hemlocks that seemed to swallow all sound. Liam moved with a grim familiarity, his silence a stark contrast to his earlier passion. This was not a journey of hope, but of pilgrimage to a place of old sorrow. They emerged into a small, level clearing, so hidden it felt like a secret the mountain had kept for itself. The light that filtered through the canopy was green and muted, and there, nestled against the hillside, was the graveyard. It was not a cemetery with rows and monuments. It was a scattering of stones, perhaps 24, small and irregular, some no larger than a loaf of bread. They were weathered smooth by decades of rain and wind. Their inscriptions, if they had ever borne any, long since worn away to faint, unreadable scars. They were not placed in any orderly fashion, but seemed to have been laid where the rocky soil allowed, nestled amongst the roots of the ancient trees as if the forest itself had taken them in. Weeds and creeping ivy had woven a shroud over many, and a few of the smallest stones had been nearly reclaimed by the earth, visible only as slight, moss-covered humps. There were no flowers, no trinkets, no signs of recent visitation. This was not a place for the living. It was a testament to loss so profound it had been entrusted to the mountain's keeping. Liam stopped at the edge of the clearing, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He didn't look at the stones, but at the canopy above. "This is the Osborne plot," he said, his voice flat, devoid of its earlier fire. "My great-grandfather buried 3 children here, 2 before their first birthday. One lived to be 5". He finally let his gaze fall to the anonymous markers. "There are others, all through these hills. Every family has a place like this, a place they don't talk about." Elara walked slowly among the stones, her footsteps silent on the thick bed of needles. She counted them, 27. Most were heartbreakingly small. She knelt by one, her fingers brushing away a layer of damp moss. The rock was cold and smooth beneath her touch. There was nothing to indicate who lay beneath. No name, no date, no comforting verse. Just a silent, anonymous weight. This was the consequence Jacob had spoken of. The price paid in flesh and blood for generations of isolation. These were the children who hadn't survived the early years, their lives abbreviated by genetic disorders that modern medicine could have identified, perhaps even treated. But there had been no medicine here, only silence and the hard, rocky soil of the mountain. Liam came to stand beside her, his presence a solid, grieving thing. "We were taught never to come up here," he said softly, "to let the past stay buried. But how do you move forward if you don't even acknowledge what you're leaving behind?" His role was clear now. He was the bridge, the one generation willing to look directly at the intergenerational trauma and name it, not to assign blame but to demand acknowledgement. This hidden field of sorrow was the foundation upon which his hope for a different future was built. The unmarked graves were the reason the silence had to end. The article was published on a Sunday, in the quiet, thoughtful pages of the magazine's long-form section. There was no sensational headline, no grainy, exploitative photo. Instead, the title was simple, stark, and respectful. "The Calculus of Survival: Isolation, Choice, and Endurance in Appalachia." Beneath it, Elara's byline stood without flourish. She had woven the story not as an exposé, but as a tapestry of human experience, threaded with the voices of those who had lived it. The lead was not a shock, but a scene. The mist clinging to the hollows, the weight of the old church ledgers in her hands, the profound silence of a community that had learned to hold its secrets close. She gave context first, painting the historical backdrop with a historian's care. The brutal geography that created islands of isolation, the economic desperation of the late 19th and early 20th centuries that turned land into the only currency that mattered, the harsh winters that sealed families in with only each other for survival. She made it clear that what followed was not a choice born of ignorance or deviance, but a series of impossible decisions made in the face of existential threat. Then, she brought in the voices, letting them tell the story themselves. She quoted May's weary, protective wisdom. Asterisk, the shame ain't in the blood, girl. It's in the havin' to choose it. It's in the knowin' that the world outside would call you a monster for doin' what you had to do to keep your children from starvin'. Star. She included Jacob's stark, factual testimony. His words on the cold, hard calculus of survival that left no room for moralizing from a comfortable distance. She wove in Esther Blackwood's diary entries, allowing the long-dead woman's pragmatic anguish and fierce determination to anchor the narrative in its heartbreaking historical truth. And she gave space to Liam's generational plea, his words a bridge from the past to a potential future. Asterisk, this silence. It's killing us as sure as any bad gene. It's just slower. Somebody's gotta break the silence, Star. She described the health issues with clinical accuracy, citing the genetic disorders common in consanguineous populations, but always framing them within the context of a devastating lack of resources and medical access, not parental neglect. She wrote of Sarah Osborne's quiet devotion, of the love that persisted in the face of immense struggle. The article's power was in its relentless humanity. It refused to exoticize or condemn. It systematically dismantled the stereotype of the inbred hillbilly and replaced it with a portrait of a resilient people cornered by circumstance, whose story was one of heartbreaking choices made in the name of preserving family and home. It was a story of a community's love for its own, a love so fierce it had sometimes manifested in ways the outside world could not understand. The final line was a quote from May, a simple, powerful coda. Asterisk, we ain't monsters. We're survivors. And maybe it's time we stopped just survivin' and started healin'. Star. The article did not scream for attention. It asked for understanding. And in doing so, it ensured it would be heard. The first sign of change was not a grand announcement, but the low, steady rumble of a four-wheel drive vehicle navigating the washed-out track into Blackwood Hollow. It was a mobile medical clinic, sent by a state university's outreach program after a geneticist had read Alara's article and initiated a grant. The vehicle, white and emblazoned with a red cross, looked alien against the backdrop of silvered wood and deep green, but it did not carry the air of an invasion. The team leader, a woman named Dr. Evans with a calm demeanor and a respectful handshake for Reverend Miller, had read the article closely. She spoke not of fixing them, but of offering resources of partnership. The clinic set up in the community hall, the same space where Alara had faced the council's fears. Now, the folding tables were covered in clean paper and informational pamphlets on genetic counseling, written in plain, accessible language, sat beside models of DNA helixes. The response was not a stampede, but a cautious, curious trickle. May was among the first, sitting with Dr. Evans for over an hour, her gnarled hands clasped as she asked quiet, pointed questions about her own family's medical history, finally giving voice to ailments that had only ever been whispered about. Liam brought his mother, who listened intently as a counselor explained recessive genes and inheritance patterns, her eyes widening with a dawning, painful clarity about the past. It was not an easy comfort. It was the sharp sting of truth, but it was a truth that carried the possibility of agency for the first time. The aid was not just medical. A nonprofit specializing in historic preservation made contact, offering grants and expertise to help families digitize and properly archive their fragile records, not to hide them, but to honor them as documents of survival. A community meeting was called, facilitated by an outside mediator who understood Appalachian culture, not to dictate solutions, but to help Blackwood Hollow articulate its own needs for the future. Healing did not mean erasure. There was no collective amnesia, no sudden desire to forget the painful history that had shaped them. Instead, there was a slow, deliberate embrace of it. The silence that had been a prison was being dismantled, brick by brick, and in its place grew a fragile but determined dialogue. They began to speak of the past not as a source of shame to be buried, but as a hard-fought legacy to be understood. The unmarked graves on the hill were not forgotten. They were now part of the story, their silent testimony finally acknowledged. The future was uncertain, and the road to it would be long. But for the first time in generations, it was a road that seemed to lead somewhere other than deeper into the isolating hills. It was a path toward integration, not assimilation, a chance to hold onto their identity while finally accepting the help they had been denied for so long. The outside world had arrived, but on terms the community was beginning to set for itself. The hope that flickered in the hollow was cautious, tempered by generations of hardship, but it was real. It was a hope not for a savior, but for a collaboration, a chance to write the next chapter of their survival story together.